So far in this series, we've looked at the problem of evil, Deus ex machina and infra dignitatem arguments, the parsimonious creation tradition, and dysteleology, all arguments, all religious traditions and arguments for a naturalistic origins that have been influential. Now, in our fifth video, we'll look at another tradition, religious rationalism and deism, and how those have been influential in mandating a naturalistic origins. So before we get into religious rationalism, which was very popular in the 17th century, I want to give you just a little bit of context, and one would be in the traditions of soteriology. What is soteriology? That is salvation, of or pertaining to salvation. How are we saved? There's always been debates about soteriology throughout the history of the church, no less so in the 16th and 17th centuries. The debates, though, in historical orthodoxy have always agreed that God is necessary for salvation. You have to have God in order to be saved. That's not up for debate. In the early church, Augustine argued that God was also sufficient. God was both necessary and sufficient for salvation. Man, in his sinful state, rejected God. And so the way that we are saved is by God saving us against our will. We're not participants, we're not willing participants, we're pushing back against God. Now, there's always been rejection or pushback against that view to have a more synergistic soteriology where man is involved as well. It's more of a team effort. God and man are working together. And in the 16th century, there was a Reformation hearkening back to Augustine. So people like Luther and Calvin revived Augustine's doctrines of the sinfulness of man, and the sole means of salvation is through God. God works against man's will. And then you had the counter-Reformation, and people like Luis de Molina on the Roman Catholic side and Jacob Arminius on the Protestant side, arguing no, it's more of a team effort. There's a role for man as well. Now, in this working out of this theology, and a lot of work was done by people like Molina and Arminius in working out these details and how does this work. So they included man in the process for a synergistic soteriology. There is a certain separation of God. God allows the world to have a certain amount of freedom and steps back to a certain extent. And so there's a certain separation between the creator and the creation. In Arminius' thought in particular, what that did was it influenced broader areas than merely soteriology. When you start to distance the creator from the creation, God from the world, that's going to also influence our view of providence and creation. I want to read to you just a couple of quotes from Richard Muller's good book on Arminius' thought and its influence on the doctrines of creation and providence. Muller writes, Arminius labors to diminish the range of positive divine causality in the world for the sake of freedom of creatures. He both limits the divine activity and loosens the causal link between God and the world. And so this is an example of how a deep theological tradition or a deep theological doctrine can have wider influences. Now, skipping down, another quote from Muller. Arminius' thought evinces a greater trust in nature and in the natural powers of man to discern God in nature. So, more focus on nature, less focus on God. The creation has a certain amount of freedom. Those are the sorts of influences from this sort of thinking. I'm not making any comments pro or con about this whole debate about these different theories of soteriology. The purpose of these videos is not to comment on Christian theology or the different theological positions, but rather their influences on science. and how the religion has influenced science. So here we have an example from soteriology, the history of soteriology, and how it influences our thinking about how God interacts with the world and creation and theories of origin. So that was one, think of that as one background influence or context for 16th century religious rationalism, which we're getting to. Another influence was all the people around the world who didn't have the Bible. Now, how are they going to be saved? Or think of the people before Jesus, thousands of years ago. How would they be saved? So there was this concern that people without the Bible, without missionaries, without miracles, without revelation, all of the things in Christian theology and the Christian teachings, Christian traditions, aren't there for certain people. How are they going to be saved? The solution that many people arrived at was, well, there must be some sort of a alternative pathway to salvation other than, the teachings of the church and so forth. There must be a naturalistic pathway to salvation. So evidences for God, evidences for the truth of God must be available through nature. A walk in the woods must be as good as going to church. And so there's a naturalistic pathway. There is a pathway available to all people at all times. So that's kind of solved that problem. So there, in that sense as well, there's a separating, there is a loosening of the connection between God and the world. True religion is more systematic, built into creation and available through creation. And not only evidences for God, but also a system of ethics. People need to know how to behave. What must they do to be saved? How should people conduct themselves ethically in any given situation to please God and to ultimately go to heaven? So a system of ethics is needed. So two things are needed there. Evidences for God and the true religion, and a system of ethics, how to conduct ourselves. So the religious rationalism in the 1600s, 17th century was concerned about those two things. It was also concerned with getting rid of mysteries. Mysteries, the religious mysteries that we have in church. You go to church and you hear some strange things. One of those strange things is the Trinity. Now, the Trinity is not a take it or leave it. It's not optional. It is, in the historical orthodoxy, the Trinity is fundamental. If you're not a Trinitarian, if you do not hold to the Trinity, you are a heretic. It's not a small problem. It's fundamental. You must accept the Trinity. So as a way for you to kind of get a feel for the influence of religious rationalism and the power that this had in the 1700s, leading figures in Britain were rejecting the Trinity. Now, this was a Christian culture, a Christian country, and people you may have read about, heard about, famous Christians, heroes of the faith, people like John Locke or Isaac Newton, were rejecting the Trinity. So that gives you an idea of the power and the influence of this religious rationalism, rejection of mystery. Now, in the 17th century, the extreme version of religious rationalism was Deism. Deism was pretty much everything I've been talking about, but to the hilt, to the extreme. Getting rid of these mysteries, emphasis on nature, emphasis on reason. You don't need missionaries. You don't need to read the Bible. The truth of God comes through nature. Let me give you a couple of book titles to illustrate this thinking. One deist book by a deist was Christianity Not Mysterious. So there you get the idea of getting rid of the mysteries. Another book title was Christianity as Old as Creation. Now, what's that all about? Well, again, Christianity is not something that you learn about through this guy named Jesus who came along, because people before then needed to know the truth. You don't get it through missionaries and through witnessing miracles and so forth. It has to be more systematic than that. Christianity as old as creation. Now, of course, there's a lot more to this story. I've gone through this rather quickly. But the upshot of all this is that there was an emphasis on nature, an emphasis on reason and evidences from nature rather than revelation for religious truth, and also a separating of God from the world, a separating, a distancing of the creator from the creation. And so one of the doctrines or traditions that came out of deism was the clockmaker God. You may have heard of that phrase, the clockmaker God. The idea there that the deists believe God creates the universe in the first place. Yes, maybe there's some miracles there in the first place. But from then on, it operates like a clock operates. The world operates on its own. So we've been looking at this idea throughout this video from the soteriology issues on up, that the tendencies to separate God from the creation, from the world, and that influences doctrines of or theories of origins, that it's better to have a God who, yes, maybe he does some miracles in the beginning just to get things going, but then you have, it runs like a clock. So the clockmaker God is this idea that stems from these deeper theological issues about soteriology, ethics, and so forth. Now, this is a fundamental, deism was short-lived. It was rebuked by Bishop Butler, but it was influential. It's one of those ideas you can't really kill. You squash it, but it's around. And it's been popular ever since. It's not as though later evolutionists would point to deism and say, aha, see, deism is true, therefore evolution must be true. It's more of a foundational building block that we're looking at. Later in this series, we're going to look at more specific religious doctrines and traditions that specifically are appealed to and were appealed to in the literature, in the evolution literature, and continuing up to this day. Deism is more of a kind of a fundamental, basic building block that just kind of permeated the thinking. So I want to finish up with an example from a contemporary thinker who is basically making this deistic appeal without using the word deism. So I'm talking about Bruce Alberts. Bruce Alberts is an evolutionist professor at UCSF. I couldn't do justice to his CV here in this video. Bruce Alberts is really at the top. He's the king of the mountain, so to speak. He's one of the leading thinkers in the life science, leading spokesman in the life scientists, and a leading a figure. He was president of the National Academy of Sciences. Well, the National Academy of Sciences is the most prestigious science organization in the United States. He was professor, as I mentioned, at a top-tier research institution in the United States. He was co-author on one of the top molecular and cellular biology textbooks, undergraduate textbooks in the United States. I could go on and on. Bruce Alberts is just this is not a tangential figure. So when I read this quote to you, I'm going to read to you a quote of what he wrote about evolution and about how we need to view evolution. But please understand, I'm not reaching here. This is not a tangential figure. Bruce Alberts is a leading top figure in the life sciences. So let's have a look at what Bruce Alberts wrote. Scientists, like many others, are touched with awe at the order and complexity of nature. Indeed, many scientists are deeply religious. But science and religion occupy two separate realms of human experience. Demanding that they be combined detracts from the glory of each. So here's this, again, the separating idea. Science and religion is the terms he's using here, need to be separated. So when he talks about religion, he's talking about, God needs to be, kept at Sunday mornings, and feely, touchy issues, and science deals with, the origins and of the world. And the hard facts of the world, and it's going to be strictly naturalistic, of course. That's the implication here. The theories of origins need to be strictly naturalistic. Now, what you need, I want to point out a few things about this quote. First, it is a religious statement. It should be obvious, but it isn't always if you don't slow down and listen and read carefully. Don't let that slip by. When someone like Albert says, science and religion occupy two separate realms of human experience, where did he get that information from? How does he know? So you need to ask, what experiment can I do to validate, confirm, test that statement that science and religion occupy two separate realms? Is that true? What if you can't do an experiment? What theory can I? What mathematical formulation? What mathematical derivation can I work on to figure that out, to come up with that? You realize there is none. And so this is not empirical science. This is not theoretical science. This is a non-scientific statement. This is a religious statement coming right out. That's why I wanted to go through this background, so you understand when you see statements like this. This comes out of deism and that sort of an idea where the world is rumbling along on its own without God interfering. These are separate realms, separate. So point number one that I needed to point out, this is a religious statement. Secondly, not only is this a religious statement, but it mandates evolutionary theory. So you have a religious theory mandating evolutionary theory. In other words, if it's true that science and religion occupy two separate realms, that God or the Creator is in some distant Mount Olympus meditating, the world is rumbling along on its own, then evolution, one way or another, must be true. It may be a mystery. We may not understand how the world possibly could have arisen by itself through naturalistic, unguided, blind means. That may be a problem, but it must be true. So we have the religion dictating to science the truth, the ultimate truth. Religion is dictating the overarching truth, and then it's left up to the student, so to speak. It's left up to the scientist to scurry about and try and answer these questions and figure out, how did this happen? How could you have the brain, the human beings, all of the biosphere, the galaxies, the cosmos, everything arose by itself? It's a great mystery. Somehow it must have happened because religion says so. So point number one was it's a religious statement. Point number two, it mandates evolution. Point number three is evolutionists are oblivious to all of this. They make these statements. They are deeply into this religion, but to them it's not a religion. And Alberts gives no hint here that he's actually making a metaphysical, religious, theological statement, that he's exposing his religious beliefs, and they are heroic religious beliefs. And when I say heroic, I mean they're not obvious. To have any serious discussion about this would require significant background discussion and contextualization and evidence and justification and so forth, which he appears to completely unprepared to defend. He's giving this statement as though it's just common sense, and that's the way evolutionists typically do. They typically make these statements as though, well, this is just a given. Right? I'm speaking the obvious here. I'm reminding the reader of what he already knows. We all should already know. I'm making a side comment almost and pointing this out. And so we're in this situation where you have these very religious people, put it that way, making these heroic claims as though they were facts. And now I'm not saying they're not true. That's not the point here. When I say heroic, I mean they're just the required defense. That's all. So whether they're true or not true, that's an interesting question. But they are religious, and they're mandating evolutionary theory. And those are what we're going to see in this video series, is those are the strong evidences. Those are the powerful arguments for evolution. They don't come from empirical science. They come from theology. Religion drives science, and it matters.